Hi, hello everyone. My name is Alex Borhani. I'm one of the co-founders of the Taurus platform, and this morning we're going to be talking about the continuous assurance process or model we're hoping to introduce. This introduces the notion of audit ready all the time, and it's an addition to your traditional CI/CD pipeline. All we're going to be doing is adding CA to the process. Now, first, we want to talk about the challenges organizations will face, and the continuous assurance model is designed to focus and assist organizations in meeting regulatory challenges, particularly around the PCI DSS, HIPAA when it comes to healthcare, SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, GDPR, other privacy regulations that are coming out. ISO 27001, which is an international security standard, along with NIST, and FISMA. These are for federally mandated systems. So these are some of the examples we are thinking about when it comes to regulatory controls and how continuous assurance will help you meet these regulatory mandates. We're going to start with giving an example, a real world example of why the Taurus platform came into being. One of our founders' daughters has type 1 diabetes. She has to be on the insulin pump in order to actually survive and live on a daily basis. The challenge was that this insulin device is managed through a mobile device. And as mobile devices change and the new operating systems come up for those mobile devices, the vendor for this IoT device did not release new software code to keep up with the changes that were happening within the rest of the technology stack. And because of that, his daughter almost died overnight because her insulin pump wasn't communicating properly with the cell phone device that the parents had to send information to say the blood sugars were spiking or dropping in her situation. Um, and this is what we call, from the Tarsi perspective, a code rot, and becomes a high risk for an organization and could actually lead to loss of life. And us, from a mindset of a continuous assurance perspective, we believe that these are things that need to be monitored for and changed in order to meet with the regulatory mandates that are out there. And a lot of organizations, through adoption of DevOps, should be able to accomplish this relatively easily. Now, DevOps does experience chaos in some regulatory industries because it makes it painful. Um, we A lot of times the developers typically lack regulatory experience, which then therefore causes a slowdown in their performance. By having a lack of understanding of the industry, that leads to low accountability, and that low accountability can lead to low quality in code. Alternatively, it's interesting is if you are in a highly regulated industry, if you're not adapting DevOps, you're going to lose your top development talent. Your tech is going to become slow and stale, and then that's going to lead and cause an experience of you potentially becoming extinct because your competition are adopting agile methodologies and they will beat you to the punch. They will steal your customers in the process. Um, so the two can come in together and actually help achieve proper, I guess, synergy in order to accomplish an excellent product in a highly regulated market. Um, Additionally, when you think about things like local and industry mandates, that does eat away at DevOps speed. And standards, when it comes to some of those mandates, are usually very legacy, and it kills the ability for DevOps to adopt modern practices. And the emphasis on quality means that it's focused more on a traditional waterfall approach and giving therefore less flexibility in iterative changes, things that DevOps loves to accomplish. You want to make sure that your product is perfect when it's launched, usually in a regulatory industry, and nothing really changes after the fact. And the reality is that once code is released into the wild, you constantly have to improve it. Um, and then the demanding security controls usually adds way too many barriers to the development process in DevOps. And the big consistent, one of the big reasons why the Tarsi platform came to be is that constant audits will suck away at the life of developers because they're going to be so busy trying to gather logs or meet regulatory controls versus actually coding. Now, we also believe that DevOps and regulation can coexist. And to do this, we have to fundamentally introduce a new notion into the CI/CD pipeline. That's continuous assurance. And assurance is facilitated throughout the entire lifecycle. It becomes joined hip to hip with CI/CD. And this involves and really requires fundamental establishment of DevOps governance, centralized log collection of CI/CD tools, application product centric correlation, and we'll talk about what we mean by application product centricness, and then automating compliance reports once those other areas are met. Now, DevOps governance really starts with proper organizational controls when it comes to your DevOps. We do want to focus on enabling developers. A lot of that becomes shift left mindset. The developers have to get a better understanding of some of these regulatory controls. They don't have to become experts per se, but they have to understand what are the actual mandates around PCI DSS, around HIPAA. HIPAA, for example, there's a strong focus around encryption at rest and encryption in transit. That's not rocket science. I mean, those are the things that we just have to be conscientious of as developers when we're building out applications that will contain patient-related information. And on top of that, it's the default configurations that need to be adopted throughout the CI/CD mindset. Security becomes a big part of that. You're going to have to introduce elements like static code analysis and dynamic code analysis throughout the CI/CD pipeline. Vulnerability scanning of your servers also become paramount. Um, the other part is this might be somewhat counterintuitive with certain DevOps organizations, but generally speaking, you want to have what's considered as authorized tech. Otherwise, you can have technology covering a wide swath of resources. That creates a lot of organizational challenge within DevOps. You don't want developers to necessarily do everything and use all the various technologies that are out there. You kind of want to have a preferred tech stack, but at the same time, it becomes preferred, not mandatory. But once you do have a preferred tech stack, you can start looking for scope creep and individuals that might be going outside of the norm and just keeping track of those technologies. Otherwise, it can create and add additional risk to your organization. And with the preferred tech stack, you then want to have proper procedures and workflows around that particular stack. And that's going to help a lot with your automation within the continuous assurance arena. Now, this should be something that's happening in most of the organizations anyways. Your CI/CD logs, including elements you might be getting from your vulnerability scanners, all that needs to be ingested into a centralized platform. And these centralized platforms can then be changed or facilitated to monitor for policy violations. A lot of organizations are already using Splunk and Elastic or Elk that can accomplish this. The Taurus platform is built inherently to support this process. With Splunk and Elk, you will have to add an additional dev resources to look for the correlation that needs to be done to help facilitate the automation of log analysis for a continuous assurance mindset. However, we facilitate it out of the box. The ensuring checks that are applied throughout the entire product lifecycle, again, that's serendipitous with CI/CD. You want to be also looking for monitor for dev performance. Governance and regulatory violations can be alerted or potentially prevented from release, and that becomes an organizational governance practice. Do you want to let code that's in violation of a regulation to actually make it into production or not? That becomes an organizational decision. But if you're going to release it and it's a violation, you should at minimum try to alert for it. Again, this is taking a look at your overall tech stack, your source code, your CI servers, your testing and your scanning, any of the artifacts that are being generated post deployment, and your monitoring. So like New Relic, all those logs should be being ingested into your centralized platform. And at the same time, You could also integrate your enterprise GRC solutions if you're using something like RSA Archer or ServiceNow, and then pulling all that information into whether it be your SIM or a log aggregation solution. You can then start applying proper mechanisms to track some of the regulatory mandates that are out there. And instead of having to worry about building logs or demonstrate evidence when it comes to the actual audit practice, that is being facilitated all the time instead of just at when an audit actually is demanded. And that automation from an assurance perspective significantly decreases the burden and taking away developers from meeting regulatory controls on a quarterly or an annual basis to focus more time on building code. Now, in order to really accomplish this, one of the notions that we think that has to be in place is a strong application and product-centric model. And this has a focus on asset inventory and tagging. You want to tie every asset you have back to your developed products. These are the applications that your organizations are creating, your servers, your developers, the APIs, the dependencies, the software that's installed on your servers, certificates you may have on those servers, databases, heck, the vulnerabilities that are being identified, they all need to be correlated back to the application. And the reason why this is so important is because the regulatory mandates and controls that are come out are usually very focused on the actual applications slash the products that your organizations are facing. When you have an audit for, let's say, SOX, they're focusing on the applications that fall within SOX controls. Therefore, it's really important to have what we're calling the product-centric model and allowing for your assets to be tied back to those particular products. And then knowing what products require a certain regulatory control or a mandate, and the amount of risk appetite you will have for all those for those each product is going to be really important. Ultimately, what we're saying is just have a really good inventory system when it comes to all these things, and tag your assets appropriately. Things that should be already happening within your CI/CD pipeline. The additional element, as we talked about, is the automating the compliance reports. Once you actually have the product-centric model in place and your assets are being properly labeled, you're able to look for things, let's say like shadow IT, monitoring your code repository and determining if there's code being introduced to the environment that you might not necessarily have a respective service ticket open for. Um, and you're able to then trace new assets for PCM attribution. So if you're having code being introduced to your Git repository and you haven't seen it before, um, you should now be able to tag that particular code to say, what product is this attributed with? If it's not an existing product, then you go ahead and then you create a new product for that specific code that's being introduced to your Git repo. If it's not authorized, it's not something that was supposed to be there, then you purge it. And that becomes elements to be able to detect and catch for supply chain compromise. For example, if a hacker gets at the environment and is trying to add new code into your Git repository, if you're monitoring for anything that's new coming in that doesn't have proper attribution, you should then be purging it from your environment. Ultimately, anything new that's being introduced into your environment, particularly your Git repository, you want to make sure that it has a product-centric model concept associated with it. And part of that ultimately what leads to is a continuous loop, just as you would get with CI/CD, where you're able to measure, interpret the data that you're getting from your logs, being able to act quickly when things are shifting from what your regulatory mandates are requiring, coordination amongst the various teams when there is an actual violation, a remediation of the violation, a testing, and making sure that what you're actually releasing out um, into your CI/CD pipeline is tested and resolved and fixed if an actual issue has come up, and then validating that the actual resolution is fixed. Um, that is already a mechanism that's built into the CI/CD process. And again, we're just adding a new notion around a continuous assurance model on top of it that helps you achieve the regulatory mandates in an automated fashion. So in a overall conclusion, just a high level overview again, for us, continuous assurance is achievable. It becomes greatly part of the CI/CD process. It's going to be designed around helping your organization be audit ready all the time, not just waiting for the last minute and trying to do a sprint to meet some of these regulatory controls because the auditors are now coming. That's not really a healthy process of how you should be thinking when it comes to regulatory mandates. Your products that you're creating should be built with the notion that they're they're safe, they're secure, they're designed on protecting your customers' data, your customers' privacy, and it's not just a snippet in time. It's something that's being done and facilitated throughout the entire life cycle of the product. Now, continuous assurance becomes a big part of that. However, in order to achieve proper continuous assurance, you have to have DevOps governance. You need to be making sure that you're leveraging your CI/CD logs, pulling them into a centralized log aggregator, Elk, Splunk, Tara, a product-centric model. And with that, focusing heavily around inventory and asset tagging, tying your developers to the actual code base as well. The dependencies that are associated with all of your code, those need to be tagged and attributed back to your actual products and the applications you're developing, along with the vulnerabilities that your static code analysis solutions, your dynamic code solutions, such as like Veracode, are able to detect. Those need to be attributed back to the product as well. And then once you're getting that information, you can start automating and generating a lot of these reports automatically on demand if deemed necessary by your compliance and then your audit teams. And once you have that in place, you're no longer having to worry about that end of the year or that quarterly audit that comes along. That information is being generated or being sent to your auditors on a regular basis, or whenever they need that information, they can pull it up themselves instead of having to tax whether it be the security team or the infrastructure or operations team or the developers. This is a very big time consuming process, usually a big headache for a lot of organizations. Why not automate that process and make it part of the overall CI/CD framework? And with that, hopefully, if you have any questions, this is the time to discuss those.